Hello and greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young, and it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Good morning. I'm Karen Christensen. I'm delighted to be here with Joe Keohane, who is the author of The Power of Strangers. And I had the pleasure of meeting Joe in Brooklyn. I don't know, everything seems like a zillion years ago, nowadays when you catch up with someone. But we actually got to meet in person over coffee, but now we're meeting online so we can talk about I wanted to pick up with him on something that he said when we met in Brooklyn, which is that seemed harder to get people to go out to be with other people. And obviously one of the things that I grew up hearing is that the topics to avoid at a dinner party, for example, were politics and religion. And of course, we're in the thick of debate over politics and religion. And Joe, in his book, picked up on that challenge, as well as just other kinds of things that interfere with our talking to strangers. So, Joe, where do you think we are right now? How do you think things are going?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Karen. It's great to see you again. And I enjoyed meeting that first time, and it's cool to be on your show. Where we are with that? Well, it's difficult. I mean, they're like the quote unquote problem of talking to strangers is that there are myriad factors that encourage us to do it and discourage us from doing it. So, I'll talk through a little bit of what keeps people from talking to strangers. I guess that's a valuable thing to understand. First and foremost, when I was growing up, we were absolutely bombarded with stranger danger propaganda. It was like an
Yeah.
endless parade of cops being trotted through our classrooms, telling us literally not to trust anyone you haven't met, which turned out to not be a super duper helpful thing to say to children for like 30 years. And that gave us an outsized sense of threat when it comes to strangers that's not backed up by the data. So the data, crime data, and I went pretty deep into this in the book, suggest that the vast majority of major crimes are committed by people known to the victim. It's actually quite rare for murder, for rape, for, your major crimes to be committed by someone who doesn't know the victim, right? So first and foremost, like if you want to freak out about the threat anyone poses, it's your neighbor, it's your uncle, like these are the people who cause these problems, less so strangers. So having a better sense of like what the real threat actually is, and I'm not minimizing the fact that bad things do happen and strangers do cause
Mhm.
crimes for sure, but let's keep it in proportion. But it goes deeper than that, like there's a psychologist named Gillian Sandstrom who's great. She's a Canadian psychologist. She works at the University of Sussex now. And she has studied a lot of the effects that talking to strangers have on people of different ages, men and women, college students, commuters, a pretty broad swath of people. And while studying those effects, she compiled an inventory of fears of what people tell her keep them from talking to strangers. And funnily enough, the biggest one isn't physical threat. It's a fear that they're just not allowed to do it, right? That there's a social norm against doing it, that this is not what we do. And you would appear chaotic or yeah.
Uh-huh. That would be so interesting to test that over time, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and she's
Huh.
attempted to do that too,
Yeah.
so that turned up a lot that people felt that they weren't allowed to do it and people
Mhm.
thought that they would be bad at it. So in Jillian's case, like they wouldn't have anything to say, they would look like they were stammering, they were getting flop sweats, like people would look at them funny, whatever. Jillian did a series of experiments to, number one, show people that they're more competent than they thought they were at this, right? So
Mhm.
she would interview people before she sent them out, and other psychologists have done this in different venues with different populations. People would, before going out to talk to strangers, would predict that it was going to be a disaster. People were going to hate this. Everyone was going to think they're crazy. And then they would all go out and they would have pretty much uniformly positive experiences.
Uh-huh.
And they would discover that people are more receptive than they thought they were, but also they were better at it than they might have expected, right? So we need to give
Mhm.
ourselves a little more credit for our kind of social abilities, right? Which should
Uh-huh.
make sense because we're a very social species. And the other thing she's tried to tackle, which is germane to what you're saying, is she kept having this thing where she would send people out to go talk to strangers, report back how it went. People would say it went great. We made friends. Younger people were
Mhm,
making dates. Like it worked out pretty well. And I've read all the survey data on these experiments, and it's
mhm.
actually very interesting, very positive findings. And then at the end of it, she would say, "Well, if you like this so much, like you just got to keep doing this. You got to do it again." And they would be like, "Hell no, I'm never doing this again. Are you out of your mind?" So getting them to like do it again becomes the difficult part. So even when they're introduced to the possibilities of this and the benefits of it, because the norm is against doing it, it's remarkably difficult to get people into the habit of doing it.
Into the habit,
Yeah.
and this was British. She was doing this in Britain?
She did one in Toronto. She's done them with American students, British students,
Uh-huh.
commuters in London, largely London, mostly around London, around
Now
England.
the
Yeah,
British, yes, the British do tend to be reticent in a different way. I mean, sort of traditionally rather
sure.
reticent about
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah, and the British will tell you that they're, like, the most unfriendly people in the world. That is not the case. The British should give themselves a little more credit on that one
Quite
too.
true, quite true.
Um,
They're actually yeah, they can
right,
be
no,
super friendly.
no, they're great talkers, but,
Yeah.
so, yeah, so those are some of the things that keep us from doing it,
Mhm.
and the good news is that they're largely unfounded, but the difficult part is getting people into the habit of doing that to change the way people live, and Jillian, she's done some things like created scavenger hunts designed to get people to maximize these interactions, have as many as they can over the course of weeks. And she's seen some benefits there in terms of people like just changing the way they are, changing the way they interact with
Uh-huh.
people. But it's tough when everyone doesn't do it, when it's not the culture. It's
Right.
very difficult to
That's
get
the
people to do
thing. If you're just trying to do it by yourself, it's one of those things that, we're connected, we're social, we need to see that dance going on.
it. Yeah, it's difficult to scale.
But when you talk about that people enjoyed it and found they were better at it, it's one of the things that I so enjoyed in your book is sometimes when I read about talking to strangers or things about, crossing the political divide, it's all very earnest. It all often sounds very earnest, where you put a lot of emphasis on the pleasure of talking to strangers, that it's fun. And that's what you were saying just now, that people did find that they enjoyed it,
Yeah,
but they
I'm glad.
still
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, but you I mean, tell us a little bit about your own experience because I think that intrigued me that you were you actually went through a phase where you were having trouble talking to strangers.
Yeah, yeah. First of all, I'm glad that that came across to you because I definitely put effort into making it as welcoming as possible and entertaining as possible because I didn't want to just beat people over the head over it with it. But also, you've read this stuff. Like I've read 1,000 academic papers, and that stuff is a nightmare to get through. So if
I
I was
suppose
just
it is.
like quoting blocks of that, then it would have been death. So I wanted to enliven it. I wanted it to sing a little bit and make it a little more playful. To demonstrate to people that this isn't like a grim social duty that you have to undertake in order to save
Yes.
the world. Like it's actually super fun, in addition to being something that's very, very beneficial to you and to society at large. So for me, I was raised in Boston, which is, an unfriendly place full of lots of good talkers, I would say. I would characterize it. And so everybody's very, like the normal the normal mode of existence is to be very sharp tongued and unforgiving to people. And so I was raised with those people, which makes you very verbal and very engaged. But I was raised, I grew up in a family of funeral directors, and my parents were super social. So they would pull things off. Like they would go to a restaurant and they would reach across two tables and just start talking to like random people and they would
Uh-huh,
pull it off like they weren't a nuisance. They would literally make friends in restaurants. They would
uh-huh.
go on vacation, they would make friends. They would go to Dunkin' Donuts, and then we would have like two more people at Thanksgiving, right? They were just acquiring people, so they're great at it. And so I grew up with that and I loved it, and it seemed normal to me. It never mortified me like it does my daughter when I talk to people.
Right.
um but it just seemed like a reasonable way to live, and I can see that it worked very well for them, and they had a ton of friends, and there were always people around, and, like, my father met bagpipers at the coffee shop and, like, brought them home for Christmas, so we had, like, bagpipes. They're super funny people too. So I grew up with that, and then, I went into journalism after college, and that in many ways is the art of talking to strangers, though in, like, a very structured and like very structured and directed sort of way. But over the course of my, my 20s, my teens and 20s, I had a lot of experiences where I would end up talking to someone and it ended up leading to something formative, right? So,
Mhm.
I'm a musician too. I'm a bass player. And I remember when I was like, 18, 19 years old, being at a music store in Philadelphia when I was in college. And I was just, showing off on the bass. And a guy comes up to me, and he's probably at that point, late 30s, black. He's dressed like a cowboy. And his name's Millard. And I feel him standing over me, and I look over, and he looks at me, and he goes, "Motherfucker, you look like Conan O'Brien." And that was his introduction to this guy, Millard Watley, who's a trumpet player who hired me to play in this amazing band, and I played in that band for years in Philadelphia. But that came out of the two of us just joking around, and like that also introduced me to, like, I was playing in gospel churches in Chester,
Mhm.
Pennsylvania. Like it was like a
Oh,
formative
cool.
experience. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was for like I grew up in a Irish and Italian neighborhood, so that was not
Yeah.
my world. So it was really cool having a way in. So, anyways, that sort of thing happened a fair amount to me. But I realized a few years ago that I had just kind of stopped talking to strangers in the wild. Like I would always be good for, joking around or whatever. But I'd stopped doing it, and I noticed that I'd stopped doing it, and I hadn't chosen to stop doing it. I just did. And I could feel myself withdrawing, and I could feel myself, doing the like sitting in a bar looking at my phone, which is the lamest shit ever. But I started to feel kind of, I started to wonder about it. I started to feel bad about it because I was losing serendipity. I was losing like a lot of fun by pulling out like that. But I also wondered what the factors were that were sort of
Mhm.
defaulting me away, right? Defaulting me
Yeah.
away from society. And so, I thought about it a little bit. And I think for me, it was the fact that I had a young daughter at that point, and they suck up a lot of time and energy, and you're a zombie half the time, and you're not a sparkling conversationalist you might have been before you had the child. So I think it was that, fatigue for one on one hand, and then the other, I just had the phone, and when you have a
Uh-huh.
smartphone, like you have an infinite well of fairly bad entertainment, but you're never alone, you're never unoccupied, and you just don't need other people, right? You can
Mhm.
conduct most of your business on the phone if you're of a certain privileged class. You don't really have to live in the world
Mhm.
anymore, right? And so it's easy and it's efficient, and we as a species default to what's easy and efficient. And so I just like disappeared into that. That was where the idea of the book came from. And in trying to answer the question of like why I had withdrawn and what was I missing, it just led me down a lot of different research avenues to understand why we are the way we are with people we don't know. What are the benefits? What are the dangers? How is it good for us? What stops us from doing it? And then ultimately, how can we get better at it? How can we rebuild ourselves as members of a social species? And yeah, the book came out of that.
It when you were talking about the challenge of kind of trying to reach out to strangers if you're the only one doing it, I think that's gotta be so true with phones 'cause I've been in places, and everybody else is on their phone, so what the heck are you gonna do except get your phone out too?
Yeah.
Um
Yeah, it's true. There's a psychologist named Nicholas Epley who did a series of experiments in Chicago and London where he dug into with his partner Juliana Schroeder, his student, he dug into you know, what people's predictions of those interactions were going to be like, right? He got there pretty early with this line of inquiry. And he asked a bunch of people, would it be more pleasurable to commute keeping to yourself than it would be to commute trying to chat up other people? And everybody was like, it's going to be much more pleasurable to just be left alone. I don't want to be bothered. No one wants to be bothered. We're just going to sit there quietly, and that's going to be fine. And then he sent them out, and he sent out a group to just do what they always do, which is
Mhm.
basically look at their phones. And he sent out a group to talk to people. And the people who talk to strangers had a much more enjoyable commute than the people who were on their phones. So there's this idea of like, I forget the term for it, but basically this collective misunderstanding that we don't understand that this is pleasurable for us, and we also assume that no one else wants to do it when in fact they're much more receptive than we think they are. I know that sounds like license to be a total nightmare and a pain to everybody else, but it's the research backs it up, and that's been
Uh-huh.
replicated in different places a bunch of different times.
Is it similar to not actually dating, but, the kind of thing of kids at a dance, say, I remember when I was young, who's gonna talk to someone else? Who's gonna ask someone to dance?
Mhm. Yeah.
that kind of anxiety about it. But of course, in the at that time, the girls wanted someone to ask them to dance, and the boys are standing there paralyzed.
Right, yeah. I mean, you're at a dance, like, you're not asking someone on the bus to dance. You're literally
Right,
at a dance.
right, you're there to do that.
But
But I did think I've been thinking about this because I saw a Guardian headline recently that said that young people were really envious of kind of old-fashioned dating. They were sick of the swiping and all that stuff. On the other hand, they were terrified about actually talking to someone directly, asking someone out
yeah,
directly.
yeah. Yeah, it's true, and you see that, I talk to a lot of professors and counselors from college, and I'm not one of those people who's, like, gleefully concern trolling the young, like, "Oh, these poor kids are so helpless. They're not like we were. We were so much stronger." They're great in many, many ways. But what I hear from professors is like profound social anxiety, a
Mhm,
profound debilitating inability to engage
mhm.
with others in person, right? And they're out of practice because they've been trained on
Yes.
digital devices. And I like, I'm not anti-technology. I love texting. I like the phone. But they're just like, you don't do it and you start to underestimate your natural abilities.
Yeah.
And then that becomes your justification for doing it even less. And that continues to inflate your negative view of your own talents at this until eventually you're just gone. And I'll hear
Mhm.
stories about kids who don't even want roommates. They want to live in the dorm by themselves. They want to go to classes remotely, even though the class is in the same building they live in. Like really extreme isolating behavior. Certainly not everybody, but like a big enough percentage that people are pretty freaked out by it.
Yeah.
And so much of that comes down to the fact that they've come to view in-person interactions as impossible, right? And
Uh-huh.
so what this research does is tell them that it's normal to be anxious, right? It's completely common. A lot of people feel that way, but it is not impossible. It's actually if you put yourself out there, it's a little easier than you might think. And then if you do it a few times, you'll catch up quickly. And I've read so many surveys with kids who participated in these and they can't believe how well it went in a lot of cases. And they can't believe how easy it is to make friends if you actually talk to people, right?
And what's the solution? Have you seen cases that really worked? I mean, what if you took all the kids and said, "No, you're gonna live in a dormitory," and I mean, shoved them all together and said, "Nobody's living alone. Nobody's going to," you sort of some sort of forced sociability. I don't know. What do people try?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of kids I talk to resent having the phone. They resent being so reliant on it, and they know that it's not healthy, and they know that it's not making them happy. But it's number one, it's the social norm, right? So, like, you go to a cafeteria and like 3/4 of the kids are on their phones. It's just how people act. It's what we
Yeah.
do, right? It's
Yeah.
very hard to push back against that,
Yeah.
even if most of them are just doing it because everyone else is doing it and they're anxious and like, it's this collective delusion. But some schools are doing some. I'm doing an event in Missouri with a Methodist pastor at a college in a month or so, where he wants to do like a big event, but also focus on like the tools, on giving students and professors too, who are also like, like no
Uh-huh.
one's no one's
Yeah.
doing no one's doing great here. No one's hitting
Yeah.
home runs.
Yeah.
We all need some
Uh,
practice, but to go in and engage people, but mainly just try to demystify it and just be like, look, it's normal that you're anxious. It's like everyone feels that way. It makes sense that you feel that way, but like if you want to try something that might help you, here's a couple easy, fun tips you can do, and then
mhm.
he could take it from there. And but this guy in Missouri wants to try to shift the culture a little bit, right?
Mhm.
But it's very difficult to do when the phones are present because like they have their own gravity. They're addictive.
Right.
And
So the
so you
phones
almost have
by
to take them out.
themselves, yeah,
Yeah, I think
are
it's
yeah.
yeah, it's like an attractive nuisance.
Yeah. So that's one huge factor. Do you think that the anxiety about the topics of discussion is increasingly important, or has that always been?
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone like the one of the unfortunate side effects of the last few years and the way we talk about politics and we talk about social justice issues is that it hasn't, on one hand it's encouraged people to engage with uncomfortable topics, but it's also freaked them out about saying the wrong thing to a member of a
Mhm.
group that is different from them. Right. I think that's definitely the case. And you hear that a lot
Yes.
being like just shutting down. Like what any sort of social justice messaging should encourage people to talk to each other. Right?
Yeah.
It should encourage friendship. It should encourage those social bonds. It should encourage cooperation. But if you put so much stress on it and freak people out, they're not going to talk to you.
That you can commit a faux pas because you use the wrong word or the wrong slang.
Yeah,
That
right.
yeah, and that I think people do get worried about that. That certainly is my impression.
Yeah,
They're worried they're gonna offend someone and they're gonna get, be in trouble. There's gonna be conflict. But also, if we aren't talking to each other and aren't talking to people who are different, we also become very unfamiliar with ways to deal with conflict. Very uncomfortable. Any kind of conflict is scary. I recorded a conversation with my friend Kathy Giuffre in Italy last week, and I said, so do people ever argue at the pub? And she said, "Oh my God, they argue." I said, "What kind of things do they argue about?" She said, "They'll argue about who's the best artist in the village, or what pieces of bad art, or the can you put parsley in this traditional dish?" Apparently, that caused outrage. The people who were for pro parsley and the people who weren't,
right,
voices raised, shouting. I finally went to the chef to argue it out.
right.
And I thought Americans, in my experience, are so terrified to argue about anything. And yet, I mean, isn't that part of the fun to talk to? I mean, it should be.
Yeah. Oh, did you
To
are you still there? We just
I'm
froze
still
for a second.
here.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fun and it helps you think. Like, this is the thing. I think we've become a little addicted to straw man arguments, just being like, well, you know what, those people think this. And like, it's always like a hyper simplified version of what they actually believe, that which you haven't
Mhm.
really engaged with. You just want to like win the straw man argument. But it definitely gives you those good, like the good arguing muscles and the ability to think on your feet. And also it can be really fun and you learn something about other people, right? I think that's like an argument, an argument without curiosity is basically American politics at this point. An argument that actually has a sense of curiosity is a great argument that will help you grow and learn and make friends.
Because that is possible. I guess that's what I was I've had conversations and someone has said something that has just made me think that the way I was looking at something was not quite I was missing something. And if we hadn't and it wasn't even an argument, but it's just 'cause you're back and forth, you're different people from different backgrounds with that different values, different experiences, and you go, "No, it's true if you think about it that way."
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great Kwame. I wrote this down, so I'm not quoting this from memory. My brain doesn't work that well. But Kwame Anthony Appiah is the philosopher at Harvard. Had
Yeah.
a line that really struck me, and the line is when a stranger is no longer imaginary but real and present, sharing a human social life. You may like or dislike him. You may agree or disagree. But if it is what you both want, you can make sense of each other in the end. That's a good argument, right?
It's a
Is like you're
good
trying to you can try to win the argument, but you have to win it by understanding what they're saying. And in the process of understanding what you're saying, you're growing, you're becoming wiser, you're becoming more worldly. And sometimes those connections lead to great friendships.
Yeah, yeah, w can you talk to us about your experiences with Braver Angels, which was specifically is a group specifically committed to bridging the political divide?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny because their ambitions are both enormous and tiny at the same time. What they try to do is literally teach people to be able to communicate with someone from the other side. Like sit at a table and have a pleasant exchange or an impassioned exchange, whatever, but not kill each other, not have contempt for each other, and not
Mhm.
dismiss each other. So it's a very simple thing, but in order to rebuild that after all the years of damage, like it's quite an undertaking. So Brave Angels was founded by two political operatives, a Republican and a Democrat, and a guy named Bill Donahue, who's a family therapist in Minnesota after 2016. And it started out as like a pilot thing where they put a bunch of Hillary voters and Trump voters together in a room just to see if they could create a context where they would be able to speak to one another.
Mhm.
Right? So no one's No one care like, they don't no one's gonna change anyone's mind. No one's gonna be best friends, like, can we get them to talk? Can we get them to
Mhm.
listen? And so Donahue created this, like, framework that would allow those conversations to happen, and it was a huge success in that first time. I mean, there were, like, literal political alliances between people on opposing sides of the political
Uh-huh.
divide in,
Mhm.
like, the same state, the same town, and they built off those things. So they scaled that out to a whole organization, and I went to their convention in St. Louis in probably 2019, I think. And it was fascinating to watch because what they trained people to do is the exact opposite of what we do now in our like runaway political neurosis, which is they don't lead with the hard stuff. Right.
Uh-huh.
So the idea is that the entire thing is structured that you have to be comfortable sitting across from each other before you can talk about gun control. And you need
Mhm.
to have some sort of respect for each other and you need to have some sort of curiosity about each other. So whereas our instinct in a time of political combat is to be like, "What do you think about gun control?" And just going after it, and nothing ever, no one's talking.
Yeah.
They're just yelling at each other. They'll sit them down and they'll have them say like, Where are you from? What brings you here today?" And then you gradually move towards the difficult stuff. And even actually one genius idea, and this is like a magic trick, is you so say I'm a Democrat, I'm talking to a Republican. I'm supposed to say, what do I believe Republicans' perception of Democrats is, right? So,
Yeah.
like, what
Yeah.
do Republicans think of it? I think you guys think that we're this, 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 and this.
Yeah.
But then you have to say, is there any truth in any of that? And when you're like, well, you know what? Yeah, we're a little shrill or a little like whatever. And that like that warms the whole thing up because you are not
Yep.
you're showing yourself not to be like a like a one like one lunged organism, right? Like you are a
Yeah.
complex person. And then as they move towards issues, you never come out and just state your belief in a dogmatic way. You have to tell the story of how you arrived at it. And so the person can again see that you're like a thinking person, you're an individual, you're complex, you're not just
Mhm.
following orders of this
Mhm. Mhm.
ideological block. And they can also like they can follow your reasoning, right? They can see what would get you there.
Mhm.
And because you're sitting right across from each other, you can't like spit at them or anything, right? Like you
Yep.
have to be civil because people are more civil in person when they're one on
Yes.
one. And then after all of that, after you've like talked about where you're from and oh, I went on vacation there once. Do you have a dog? All that stuff. And then you move into the difficult stuff. But
Mhm.
the goal of it is for each person to be able to articulate the other person's view in a way that the person agrees with. That's
Mhm.
the goal, right? Which seems like reading comprehension 101.
Oh. Oh, I see.
We
Yeah.
never do that. Like, if you ask any
Yeah.
really committed partisan to characterize the other side's view of something, it will not be in a way that the other side agrees with, right? So it
Yes.
forces you to listen and stop, like pull back on the straw man arguments. Like, you do this because you hate women. You do this because you hate religion. It forces you to see that there's a little bit of nuance here and
Mhm.
attach a human being to this, right? And it
Mhm.
makes it a little more difficult to dismiss the other side as just like a unified block of witless ideologues, right?
Right. I've been in groups. I live in Massachusetts, very blue. I remember once after some election or other, someone just saying, "They're all evil."
Right. Yeah.
And boy, we need to get past that because that is not the case. It is, nothing is as simple as that. I was on the Braver Angels website this morning and I was intrigued by the pairings, the topical pairings there. They've added Israeli Palestinian partnering for conversations. They also, for me, very interesting, they have an urban rural
Mhm.
pairing
Yeah.
which we don't hear about enough, but except people refer to it in an abstract way, in political discussion, disparaging the urban elites or disparaging the rural voters, where especially because I mean this is a issue really important to me, that kind of bridging that divide because I see it because of where I live.
Yeah, and that's a
I thought that was
real
smart, really smart.
and necessary too because increasingly as I forget the guy's name, but a journalist coined the phrase the big sore, which is just
Mhm.
everyone sorting into their opposing camps, that it's
Yeah.
become geographical where people don't even live together. So the idea of bridging, of making these connections, of talking to strangers from different groups, like they don't live within 100 miles of you a lot of the time.
Right.
So it's really important to do that. I always joke, I mean, a half joke, because it'll never happen in a million years, but some sort of exchange program where people who grew up in cities spend like a year in a rural place, and people from rural places spend a year in cities. Like when you get out of college or when you turn 18 or whatever
Uh-huh.
it is, would be massively, massively helpful.
Could be really, really helpful because there are great things about both environments. And we, if you don't know them both, I think there must have been a children's book, but Country Mouse, City Mouse,
Mhm.
a long time ago. But I must take a look because it was, how they were each afraid of the other mouse's habitat. And I think we get like that, and people are shaped by the places they live and end up caring about things for reasons that really make sense if I've had to think about this.
Yeah, and
Well,
I think I think it's really reassuring too to show people that it's possible to talk to someone from a different place. I think that's like,
yeah.
it's tied to what we were saying earlier, where people are so anxious about like, really, really rural people, really urban people are anxious about the prospect of talking to someone from the other place. They don't think it's going to go well. They think it's going to be difficult. They don't think they have the tools. They think the person's going to freak out, all these things. And when you do actually interact with people, as equals, ideally in person, you find that it is possible. And it's tremendously reassuring to know that it's possible to have a completely banal conversation, right? You don't have to save the world. You just need to start there. And we can start there. We just have to do it. And there's a lot of impediments between here and there.
What advice to wrap up? What advice would you give someone who thinks, I think this sounds appealing. I should do more. I should put down my phone and talk to strangers. What would you suggest as a first?
Yeah, you can just warm yourself up to it. So you don't have to just like step up to someone and have some intense philosophical conversation. In the book, I go through this step by step of like rebuilding yourself from zero. Start by just noticing people. Put the phone away, and when you walk down the street, notice people and be curious about people, wonder about them, think about them. Psychologists have found that that conveys some of the benefits that talking to strangers conveys.
Mhm.
If they're doing something interesting, then you can work your way up to like, commenting on it or asking about it and then see how that goes. When you start talking to people, ask very simple questions, like, who is that? Why are you doing this? How does it work? And then let them talk and then really listen. And then in time, most of the interactions I have are just like funny little interactions, but sometimes you do wind up in a more profound conversation when you have time and you have space.
Mhm.
But, just allow that variety, but indulge your curiosity. I think one of the biggest problems with society today is the death of curiosity about others.
Mhm.
I think we have to exercise that a lot more, and you have to have the courage to talk to people about it.
Yeah.
And it tends to go pretty well.
So it's putting this thing away. This is the putting the phone away a lot of the time and letting life happen.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's a really good message. Well, I think we could talk much more. I'm looking forward to seeing you. You gave me some tips about places to visit in New York too that I haven't taken up
Um,
on
yeah,
yet,
yeah.
but I
All of them.
will.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
will soon.
Good, good.
Uh,
Where are you in Massachusetts again?
I'm in Great Barrington.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I
So
was
it's
in Goshen 2 weeks ago.
oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
my buddy lives in Goshen.
Oh, yeah, not far away at all.
Yeah.
Well, we'll meet up again soon, but thank you very much, and I will get this uploaded. I think this is exactly the right moment to get people thinking about this. I think, it's a time that's sort of fraught politically, but it's also full of opportunity.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I
and
agree.
the work you're doing is spot on.
Cool. Thank you, Karen. Same to
Thank you
you.
very much.
Yeah, keep me posted and let me know when you come back to New York too. Okay.
Super.
Cool.
Okay, see
All
you
right.
soon. Thanks,
See ya.
Joe. Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter at KarenChristensen.substack.com.